How many times have you seen the meme that goes something like, me listening to a song, looking out the car window, pretending I'm in a sad music video? It seems like it's a universally shared experience, and every time I see it, it reminds me of one of my early core memories. When I was around 6, I was sitting in the backseat of my parents' minivan, looking out the window while listening to the radio.
I still hear your voice when you sleep next to me.
The song playing on the radio was Every Time We Kiss by Cascada, and I swear it felt literally like liquid gold, pure euphoria in sonic form, and my surroundings seemed more vibrant, exciting, and full of love as it played. I remember the song ending and In the End by Linkin Park began. Maybe I was just a dramatic ass 6-year-old, but I swear to God, this song was like depression personified. I instantly remember feeling like my world had become suddenly so gray, almost like it had lost all its color. And I didn't know it at the time, but I'm pretty sure the song made me so sad that I was experiencing some form of borderline depression. Ever since that moment, I began to see music as a powerful tool that can completely change how you feel and even help express suppressed, painful emotions. This observation became even more apparent when I was a teenager and had my first experiences with severe depression. Now, not to get too dark here, but at times I got so depressed that I sometimes had unaliving thoughts. But what was so fascinating to me was how these type of thoughts created a paradox. I would get so sad that it would consume my entire reality, conquering my mind and creating a sort of singularity of suffering, reaching a crescendo the moment I thought about and even at times planned unaliving. The thing is though, the moment this thought entered my mind, the singularity collapsed because it instantly brought relief. And I knew I could only ever do it if the suffering were unbearable. The way the worst thought imaginable canceled out the suffering that caused it by creating momentary relief reminds me of the topic of this video and the paradoxical comfort that sad music creates. If you've ever experienced depression or something similar to what I just described, you may have noticed just how powerful sad music can be at providing comfort when it seems nothing else can. It seems so paradoxical, but it's almost like hyper-focusing on your emotional pain and accepting it instead of trying to escape it makes it much more bearable. Today I want to talk about the power of sad music and why it's so addicting and cathartic for so many. We'll talk about why sad music has become so dominant since the 2000s and how creating art based on trauma can transform it into something we can appreciate and accept instead of something to avoid and suppress. We'll touch on the dangers of indulging too much in sad art and how capitalism has commodified and in some ways even promoted mental illness for profit. We'll also explore how sad music can become a way to almost transcend our trauma and express our wounds in a safe, controlled way, and how that can help us truly heal.
Baby, can't you see?
Anyone who grew up in the early 2000s would probably agree that the music from that time was really contrarian. We were just coming out of the 90s era of optimistic dance music and entering one of emo rock bands and cynical depression becoming the mainstream.
Wake me up inside.
Artists like Linkin Park, Green Day, and Evanescence dominated the charts, and the popularity of this relatively new genre, emo music, helped reflect bigger trends in society and culture at the time. In an article titled Seen and Heard: How Early 2000s Emo Wrote the Branding Playbook, Michelle Strom writes about the rise of emo and how it reshaped pop culture at the time. The emo scene was a reaction to the hyper-masculine mainstream rock culture of the late 90s and early 2000s. As a result, fans gravitated towards bands that were honest and wrote about their struggles with depression and anxiety. Early on, the scene was dominated by bands like Dashboard Confessional and Jimmy Eat World, sad boys who sang about heartbreak and self-discovery. However, with the rise of early 2000s internet culture, away messages, LiveJournal, MySpace, it swiftly transformed into a lifestyle, a badge of honor worn by fans who felt alienated by the mainstream. The emo aesthetic typically characterized by band tees, heavy eyeliner, dyed hair, and distressed Converse sneakers, was more than a fleeting fashion trend. It wasn't just about looking cool, but building community and identity through shared symbols. They wore their heartbreak on their sleeves and their t-shirts. Emo was about finding yourself in a sea of confusion and self-discovery. It was a way for young people to connect through shared experiences. In other words, the rise of emo music and culture was just another backlash against the mainstream forced strength and positivity in music, embracing a more authentic emotional expression and destigmatizing mental illness and suffering through art. For those who found comfort in emo music and bands, the genre felt like an escape through acceptance, a way to not only accept your pain, but also indulge in and reclaim it, ironically turning it into something beautiful and meaningful instead of ugly and irrational. The way that emo culture also fostered community and a sense of relatability mirrors why sad music can be so powerful regardless of the genre. For those who suffer from mental illness, many often overwhelmingly experience feelings of shame and alienation, as if they're alone in their suffering, but subcultures like emo or scene can help build strong social bonds around a common experience, creating a situation similar to group therapy, and therefore inadvertently help listeners cope and process their pain. Like Michelle Strom writes about emo music being a reaction against the hypermasculine rock of the 80s and 90s, I think this rise in sad culture also stems from other trends in society as well.
But I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
This is unreal. Isn't this disgusting?
Beginning in the 70s, living standards for Americans and Westerners in general began to decline as deindustrialization accelerated and neoliberal economic policies were continually implemented. By the 90s, the mass suburbanization that had taken place in the 50s and 60s was 2 generations baked into the system at this point, and the isolation it fostered, along with those declining living standards, were starting to bear their fruits. We can see these fruits first appearing with the popularity of teenage angst and grunge music in the 90s, the emo scene era in the early 2000s, and eventually the Tumblr sad girl, SoundCloud sad boy eras of the 2010s. The popularity of the emo movement in the early 2000s helped further the trend that began with grunge music in the 90s and became all-consuming in the 2010s. Upbeat optimism is out, slow, depressing, existential dread is in. And I know I've talked about the popularity of sad music before and how some love to point out that they think I'm exaggerating or that sad music has always gone in and out of style, but I'm actually not the only one who notices this trend.
Only you.
Ted Gioia from The Honest Broker writes, "The most obvious feature of a sad song is the tempo. It tends to be fairly slow, often between 60 to 70 beats per minute, like a relaxed heartbeat. Not long ago, this tempo was a rarity on the Billboard chart, and when you did hear a slow song, it was usually a romantic love ballad for slow dancing. But the average tempo of a hit song has been getting slower since the dawn of the new millennium, but slow dancing has almost disappeared. The slow tune is no longer dreamy music for couples, but sad, lonely music for the isolated and depressed. It doesn't help that handheld devices, earbuds, and other pervasive technologies have turned music into something consumed alone, not communally as it was in the past. Another telltale sign of sad songs is the minor key. This rise in minor key songs has been dramatic. Around 85% of songs were in a major key back in the 60s, but in more recent years, this has fallen in half. Gioia also buys into my thesis, basically pointing out that music took a turn around the late 90s and early 2000s to express a more pessimistic, depressing sound, which I think is just reflecting the cultural trends in society at large, showing us that not only is it more accepted to express darker emotions in general, but also that our societies and cultures themselves are generally becoming more cynical and depressing. Like a great thinker once said, movements in art are like checking the pulse of a society. It's a collective reflection of people's psyche and perception of the world at any given time. In the same way, what I think we are observing within these trends in art and culture is again a confluence of many factors coming together and affecting society and the people within it as a whole. A mass decline of economic standards beginning in the 70s and 80s, social isolation through suburbanization, mental illness, drug use, and generational family dysfunction in response, And with terrorism, recessions, political instability, and negativity-driven algorithmic-based social media in the 2000s and 2010s, this trend exponentially accelerated. In short, music is getting sadder, slower, and more cynical in general, and it's not just a trend or something that's an edgy, meaningless aesthetic choice, but rooted in much more foundational societal trends at large. Now that I briefly explained the more physical, structural causes of the rise in sad music in general, I wanted to bring the conversation back to what I touched on earlier with emo music and how there is power in reclaiming your trauma by indulging in your sadness through art. Like I briefly touched on in past videos, the European Romantic movement from the 18th and 19th centuries can be seen as planting the seeds for the current hyper-emotional, romanticizing everything, including trauma and sadness era that we live in today. Now, I already explained what Romanticism is in depth and why we are seeing a resurgence of it today, using Lana Del Rey as an example in a past video. So for the sake of time right now, I'm just going to quickly summarize for those who may not know what it is. Romanticism was basically a movement in art and culture that rejected past movements of rigidity, reason, and inevitable optimism, and instead embraced emotion, irrationality, nostalgia, and individualism. So obsessing over a lover and writing all these poems and idealizing everything about them, or indulging in your sadness, heartbreak, and focusing on expressing emotions instead of repressing them, would have previously been seen as irrational and immature, but with Romanticism, it was embraced and seen as a refreshing new way to view the world. These emotion-based appreciation of the range of human experience, including tragedy, values, are features we can also find in sad music today. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of modern sad music is how it frames trauma in this irrational, romanticized, indulgent way. I think the song Put Me in a Movie from the album Lana Del Rey, aka Lizzie Grant, is a perfect example of irrationality and indulging in taboo themes. Now, for those who may not know, this song is considered pretty controversial, even to people who like Lana, and the reason I'm bringing it up isn't because I personally like it, but because of the response I saw to it by some people. For those who don't know what the song is about, it basically romanticizes age gaps, or more accurately, SA.
Put me in a movie. Put me in a movie.
And to most people, that scene is pretty irrational, even gut-wrenching or deeply disturbing. Again, making use of those romantic values of rejecting rationality and embracing tragedy. Now, like I said, the majority of people who have heard this song find it creepy and very disturbing, but I did find that some people who are actually also victims of SA said that it somehow gave them peace and made them not feel so shameful about what they had experienced. Almost like it was a form of artistic reclamation, helping those who have experienced horrific things to flip the script and take away some of the dark power it had over them. I feel like I have to keep saying this just to be safe, but do I think we should romanticize or normalize SA? Obviously not, but I did want to use this song and the general idea of how indulging in trauma by transforming it into art can help others cope, no matter how irrational or paradoxical it may be. Again, a lot of what I'm talking about here isn't unique to Lana or really any artist, but is tied to the whole philosophical concept of romanticism and how it encourages you to accept all experiences in life, including dark ones, and promotes a more emotional approach to art. Another common response I saw to this song and what others who enjoy dark art despite it being based around their trauma have said was how it helped them to process what had happened to them by safely allowing them to access memories that would typically be suppressed as the brain attempts to protect itself. As someone who has complex PTSD and who obsesses over psychology and sociology, this concept is so fascinating to me. A lot of people, or neurotypical people, may view listening to lots of sad music as just that. Sad and suffering inducing, so it can seem counterproductive. But the thing is, it's not that simple, and a lot of people would probably be surprised to find out that indulging in your sadness can also be beneficial. The human brain is so complex, and the evolutionary processes that gave rise to it roughly prioritizes three main things: survival, energy conservation, and reproduction. Trauma disrupts the brain and causes emotional distress, making you vulnerable. And before the relatively recent development of civilization, that meant you became an easy target for predators, which then obviously eliminated your ability to reproduce. So in response, the brain evolved to protect you in the name of survival, whether it be by inducing disassociation during traumatic events so you don't have to directly experience them, or by blocking your ability to access traumatic memories once the events themselves had passed. These adaptations can help minimize the distress caused by trauma and allow you to better function on a day-to-day basis, enabling you to survive another day and potentially pass on your genes. The thing is though, nothing is perfect, and while these adaptations can help you survive in the short term, the body and mind will never be able to completely forget, and so the trauma will then manifest in other ways: anxiety, depression, flashbacks. And with the advent of modern medicine and psychological research, we now know that the best way to escape this cycle of suffering is to process what happened to you, giving yourself grace and empathy so your mind can untangle it all, and eventually you'll hopefully be able to live a more normal, healthy life. But like I said, to do this, you have to be able to access the memories of these events so you can process and grieve. But again, the brain often guards these memories to protect you. And this is where sad music, and even just art in general, comes in. Listening to sad music, and honestly any music at all, can help you transcend your physical limitations and access these locked away experiences, allowing you to finally re-experience, process, and eventually grieve what happened to you. And while as living beings we want to avoid suffering at all costs, in order to free yourself from trauma, you have to allow yourself to feel your emotions and then grieve, and music can help jumpstart that process. Sad music isn't just beneficial for unlocking trauma or processing past events, but it can also be a tool that helps you release pent-up emotions. How many times have you heard someone say that they just love sad music so much because it makes them cry, and after they've done so, they then feel so much better? It's sort of the same concept as unlocking trauma. Some people struggle with showing emotions, and sad music allows them to feel vulnerable. Crying has actually also been shown to have beneficial biological effects, with many feeling refreshed and rejuvenated once they've done it. This is why so many relate to that one meme about weirdly feeling happy or energized or even confident after a good cry or mental breakdown. Crying can be an emotional release, and not everyone can do it even when it's justified, meaning sad music can be a useful catalyst. Like we briefly discussed earlier with emo subcultures, sad music, sad artists, and the fan bases that tend to develop around them can also create a sort of fan-driven community, helping those who feel isolated become more grounded and able to process their pain with other like-minded individuals. What so many fail to understand is just how social human beings are, and how so much of our mental illnesses stems simply from a lack of community, with sad music subcultures helping provide that for so many. So in short, listening to sad music can help us in three main ways. One, sad music can help us transcend our traumatized brains by allowing us to access painful experiences, but in a safe, controlled way. Two, it can remind us that we're not alone, which is essential, being that humans are incredibly social animals. And three, it can also just give us a sense of catharsis, a tool to help us release emotional buildup, leaving us refreshed after we've had a good cry and really indulged in sad emotions. By the way, the idea of catharsis doesn't just apply to sad music, but can be expanded to include all forms of dark art, including things like watching disaster or horror movies. Were you ever obsessed with movies or events that revolved around tragedy or trauma, like 9/11 or the Titanic? Do scary movies bring you this strange sense of peace? You might just be suffering from some form of locked away trauma, and witnessing others go through their own, but safely, like watching a scary movie from the comfort of your bed, might just be helping you process it. But this concept of catharsis from trauma art, as I like to call it, is the topic of my next video, so subscribe if you're interested in all of that. Now, something I want to point out as well is that liking sad music and indulging in your suffering can be cathartic, but also sort of dangerous. Indulging too much in your pain sometimes leads to rumination or unhealthy behavioral cycles. Depression itself is often based around getting stuck in unhealthy self-perceptions and an obsession with rumination, like negative thought patterns that tend to reinforce themselves. While subculture centered around sadness can help build community and relatability, they can also romanticize it too much, leading to sadness becoming almost like a badge of honor. Not just something to not be ashamed of, but also something that is now a necessary prerequisite to create good art. Capitalism can also further this by commodifying art inspired by sadness through the use of profit incentives, taking it from something originally born from genuine expression as a way to cope, and transforming it into a brand to be sold and therefore promoted. Mental illness then becomes not something that should be seen as an issue to correct, but a valuable commodity that can be bought and sold through the use of aesthetics or manufactured sad personas. So just like with all things, the main thesis of my video isn't absolute. Enjoying sad music can have its benefits, but unrestrained indulgence can reinforce the mental issues that make it so relatable instead of helping ease the suffering they cause. Now I want to discuss how creating art centered around negative experiences can help shift how we perceive it by associating it with positive emotions. Again, using Lana Del Rey as an example. Lana's music has not shied away from dark topics such as drug use, SA, or domestic violence, and while to those who haven't experienced these things, that may seem irresponsible or even like she's promoting them, to those who can relate, they sometimes find it makes them feel seen and allows them to associate some form of pleasure with their trauma. And I know that sounds so weird, but take Lana's lyric, "He hit me and it felt like a kiss" from Ultraviolence, for example. While that lyric is describing an objectively terrible experience, for many who do suffer from domestic violence, it also captures what that sort of dynamic or relationship can be like. Most people who suffer from DV obviously don't associate it with positive emotions, but hearing it in a really good song flips that script, causing your brain to release feel-good chemicals like dopamine and endorphins, and can help process and heal from negative experiences by now associating them with more positive sensations. The way music can do this, again, helps those who suffer from trauma by allowing them to re-experience it in a more pleasurable, safe way due to the positive effect music has on the brain, providing a sense of comfort and relief instead of the usual distress. Again, this isn't to say that domestic violence is good because a song sounds good, but just that it can help some people process these events and shift their perspective through the use of good art. Ethel Cain also does something similar to Lana, albeit in a more detailed, mythologizing way. What Ethel Cain does on Preacher's Daughter is genuinely so fascinating to me, especially as an artist myself. Preacher's Daughter was a concept album, meaning the characters and events in it were fictional, but the way it tells such a horrifying story in such a beautiful way through genuinely good musical production is so unique and refreshing. The themes within the album include American Southern culture, religious trauma, abuse, and the American dream. What Ethel Cain does on Preacher's Daughter is subvert and reclaim aspects of Southern culture, queer identity, and trauma. I think it accomplishes what I explained in this video so perfectly, using art to expose, explore, and reclaim painful experiences by making them somewhat pleasurable through the use of music. It forces us to reckon with horrifying realities, but the dopamine-inducing qualities of good art help make it more tolerable. I think you could argue that this is one of the main purposes of art. Help us explore difficult topics and themes, but in a safe, controlled way. And also, I have a much more detailed video planned on the genius of Preacher's Daughter and Ethel Cain coming soon, so I'm gonna save all the good bits on her for that video. Now I want to solidify the thesis of this video by quickly telling you all about an interaction I recently had with a friend. We were talking about popular music today and how sterile and inauthentic it has become, but also how that's kind of the point and business model for some. What we meant by this was that some artists may seem so bland or boring or cookie cutter, like they're too risk averse and never really pushing any boundaries, but also how they are somehow massively famous for it to the neurotypical. He ended the conversation by jokingly saying something like, "I think in order to be a good artist or to make really good art, you have to basically be some sort of crazy." And I actually think that perfectly captures the point of this video. Like emo music reclaiming emotional expression and vulnerability, Lana Del Rey romanticizing tragedy, or Ethel Cain making an album about horror and trauma, good art takes the ugly, the suppressed, the avoided, and paradoxically transforms it into something significant and pleasurable. Good art inherently rejects the rationality and conformity of mainstream reality by flipping it on its head and challenging assumptions. This is also why some argue that there is no good conservative art. Conservative, by definition, is culturally based in preservation and conformity. It doesn't push any boundaries, it doesn't challenge anything, it doesn't look forward and attempt to create something new. It's born from the status quo, and good art is innovative and provocative. In this way, it can be argued that art based on trauma or sadness is the most powerful form. Sad art and the pleasure it creates are inherently paradoxical, and that makes it all the more fascinating. It completely focuses on something humans should avoid: suffering. But somehow it creates this magical space where we can simultaneously experience suffering and pleasure, giving us the ability to transcend normal human experience, even if just for a moment, so we can heal and find better purpose in our tragedies. This is why so many find sad music so addicting. It somehow flips the power dynamic, granting those who have suffered under the oppression of mental illness new agency over their lives, allowing them to appreciate and process their experiences in a subversive, empowering, mindful way.